Jar of Flies by Brandish Gilhelm. I walk between the pillars. I walk among them, meandering here and there in motes of light. Some stand in brick perfection, others crumble with grey ruin. I walk along and choose souls to make my own. This hunger rises again, and something catches my eye. A girl. In her will my ravenous heart beat. It will all happen again. She stirred just before dawn. The scratchy wool blanket was pulled to her chin, and her feet were folded under two tight sheets in the chilly gloom of the dormitory. The other children had all gone, and the loneliness was deafening in those small hours. It started happening again. The itch, the restlessness behind her eyes. She blocked all the weird memories and braced her skin for the morning air. Against all her cozy instincts, she pulled the blanket back. Her gown was frivolous and cumbersome, though light as a feather and useless on fall mornings. The floor was ice. Her little toes turned pink there landing, and she glided across the room without a sound. At the misted window gable she lurked like a moody statue. Beyond the muddled glass only foggy dim and tree fingers shone. Her glare pierced this, though. She could hear them, 1,000 tiny mouths twitching and gnawing on a wet kill in the distant woods. She could feel the tiny legs flitting and scratching, preening and biting like tweezers on a rotted plum. It was happening again. Her trance was broken by distant headlamps. A motor car. The gloomy beams bobbed lazily through the morning damp, coming up the road. No doubt some new bright heart to solve all the hill's woes. Poor fools, drawn like moths to the doom at her feet. She looked at them, her feet, and the cold took root at last. She shivered and fled back to her scratchy blanket. The voices came after the motor car sputtered to a stop, and she felt a terrible sadness. She felt a guilty horror, a confused kind of resignation to those poor limbs. More graves for the grinder. It was happening again. And she had no idea how to stop it. Like a paralyzed dreamer, it played out before her again and again. "We've a new treatment, you see," were the first words she heard beyond the painted door. The green color was flaking away with neglect, but she leaned her cheek against it anyway, and held her breath. "Most importantly, we've a new group of children on their way. 7 boys from St. Mary's, all recuperating well thanks to this sunny weather." "Well, if you believe it's best," came the other voice. It was Sister Stacia, the nun who had remained here when all others were gone. "I'll have Mr. Stilson fill the larder and open the waterworks. Poplar Hill will make a fine home for those boys. I just hope Grace isn't perturbed by them. She can be so reclusive." "Seclusion and isolation may be the root of her despair, sister," the man from the motor car replied. "Bright days and easy laughter are the best medicine." There were more sounds, whispered words, but Grace could not hear through the door. Footsteps threatened her secrecy, and she recoiled from the door with nowhere to hide. In the portal then revealed were Sister Stacia, kind and short as a stump, and the tall, dark-suited figure of a middle-aged man. He was beyond 6 foot, with pleats and scarf to accent his height. Grace took a step back. "Oh, hello," he said. His voice was huge in the normally silent space. "You must be Grace. My name is Howard Stance." He extended one giant hand to meet her. She was motionless at first, but Stacia's smile gave her a tiny courage. She took his hand in hers. It was warm and blocky and strong as steel. She dared look up at his face, which was kind and handsome. She could feel herself blush. This broke her bravery, and she pulled her hand back, looking at the floor. Howard chuckled. "The pleasure is mine, miss." He lifted his hat slightly, promising return. Sister Stacia saw him out, and then returned herself. "We're to host new children, little bird," Stacia said. 7 young boys. And Dr. Stance will be staying with us, too. It promises to be a lovely summer, don't you think?" Grace was frigid again. She was angry, too, feeling foolish for her shy cowardice. Could Dr. Stantz really help her? Could he make it stop? She gave Stacia no answer, but met her eyes for a microsecond, and this was enough for the smiling nun. Good. Then there's much to do. Come help me in the kitchens. They went together, cleaning and arranging, sweeping and stacking. It was a normal afternoon, which was a rare thing here. Through all her chores, Stacia humming in the background, Grace imagining Dr. Stantz's face. His eyes were so kind, his jaw so square. She felt a sort of warm wave rush over her and felt embarrassed. These feelings she shook away. Can't let it happen. Not again. She missed the loneliness. Grace pulled the scratchy blanket over her head. The boys were awake before her again, prattling about nonsense and wiggling like grubworms in their beds. They argued over yesterday's playground squabbles, or who smelled worse, and Grace closed her eyes tight with annoyance. Like every day so far, she let them eat breakfast first, then appeared like a mouse to peck at the kitchen counter. Sister Stacia let it be, tending mostly to the boys with an unspoken worry. Dr. Stantz was her refuge. Each day she met with him, and they talked. Well, he did most of the talking. Grace would sit across from him, nervous but motionless, eyes down. She would nod now and then, or mumble a response. Mostly the handsome doctor speculated on the nature of the occurrences over and over, offering her explanations of all kinds for the trouble. "It's good to see you out in the grounds, Grace," he began that morning. "How are you feeling today?" "Fine," she murmured, admiring his black leather shoes. "I'd like to try something to help you remember." She looked up at that. This must be what he had been sent here to do. Her stomach tightened. He said more things. It was all fuzzy, and Grace slipped back into her dreams. She hated being there. She was mad at him now for taking her there. Mad, and it made her crush on him even worse. The whole thing was all crisscrossed between dislike and desire. It was awful. Before she could complain to herself, they were there, right in front of her. The trees bent inward, the sky was weird with memory's deletions, and there they were, a mound of vibrating wings and pivoting eyes. They loved her, the botflies. They all loved her like a queen, and she could feel it. She could feel their eyes on her, their light-speed minds picking at the red heap, scanning the woods, sizing her up, flying for a nanosecond to alight again in some sticky lump. "I don't want to be here," she heard herself say. But that was the voice of some other girl. She was above or outside the scene, like a wraith. The girl Grace stared motionless at the mound of black insects, but her bodiless will looked around in a semicircle. The ground was littered with pieces, or chunks of someone or several someones. A hand here, a bit of ragged skin there, a scatter of red and white bone fanned like gravel across the grass. At the center, the heap slumped and oozed, covered and humming with thousands of flies. Or was it millions? In a rush, she was sucked back into her girl self. She could feel them. The hideous, emotionless wills of those parasitic automatons. She felt them and they felt her. They were one. One step forward took she, toward the heap, and they took wing in unison. The noise of it was staggering, but she was unfazed. In a spiraling cloud they flew into the forest and vanished in an instant that only a dream could explain. And then she was left alone with the heap. In the red and the dripping and the torn clothes, she saw their faces. It had happened again. "Grace," Dr. Stan's voice interrupted. "Grace, you're here with me now. You're safe. It's over. It's over, Grace." She blinked, baffled and suddenly freezing cold. She was back in the office with Howard. He leaned toward her, kneeling next to her little couch. He was strong and smart and so close. She felt faint and let him hold her upright. "Poor thing. I'm so sorry, Grace. We'll have no more of that memory. No more at all." After that, Dr. Stantz became troubled, anxious. He was busy with letters and odd doings, and Grace saw him less. Her days were spent in worry and wandering, avoiding the boys and wondering when Dr. Stantz would summon her again. And then things changed. Fools, drawn to their dooms like moths, she thought. What mind can sanely consider the lightless reaches of hell beyond our mortal coil, and see there order in chaos, or purpose in cruelty? Is there even reason to be found in evil's womb? Either way, the demonic had descended from its cold perch into Grace's heart like a bolt of lightning, and her power could no longer be held at bay. Just like last time. It was always one little thing that would rouse the demon, one detail. So volatile was that evil in Grace's heart it simply lay in wait, tucked under a scratchy blanket in her mind, waiting to pounce. So it happened again, that fall day on Poplar Hill. "Grace," Dr. Stantz began, "what's the matter? You seem so distant today." He leaned forward, setting his notebook aside, genuinely concerned. Afternoon light drifted in through the wooden panes. "She can never love you, you know," Grace began, speaking with a strange, deep tone. "Grace?" "Sister Stacia, I found the little flower." "Grace, you never should have come here." "Did you think you could make it stop? Did you think you could stare evil in the face and push it back into the pit? Did you come to count the dead or join them?" I came to help. You need help, Grace. It has to stop. No one knows that better than you." He was afraid now, talking faster, tense in his chair, hands on wooden arms. "All who come here never leave, Dr. Stantz. You know that. Poplar Hill is a graveyard, nothing more." She was lifting her head, but outside herself again. The dark will rose in her gut. "You must fight it, Grace. How many decades? Centuries? How many lives? The dead are piled so high you can't even breathe. I can see it." He sensed her murderous heat now and started to stand. At that, the worst possible moment, Sister Stacia came creaking through the office door with a tray of tea. A single white daisy was pinned to her collar. On this, Grace's eyes locked. Stacia sensed the odd moment and paused, eyes darting. "Howard, is everything all right?" Dr. Stantz said nothing, only widening his eyes. His throat bulged as if constricted from within. "Grace?" But it was too late. Grace was scowling, eyes milky with empty hate. The daisy wilted to a black shrivel, crumbling away. Stacia was paralyzed, the tray trembling. "Grace, please!" "Quiet!" Grace heard herself scream. Sister Stacia's head collapsed. It sort of crumbled inward in a red mush. This a man could see and only scream, but Howard Stantz had no hope of sanity's grasp when Stacia's body stayed stick straight, headless, holding that tray. From the teacups, flies began to crawl, then pour. They scurried and twitched, and then emerged from the smashed skull in waves. In seconds, the room was swirling with them. The flies moved in an ever-thickening wave, covering everything. Even Grace, their terrible master, was overcome with the awfulness of it. She flinched and lifted one arm to shield her face. At this instant, Stantz was released, shook his head clear, and bolted for the door. Through the black insects he plowed like a wagon wheel through muck, tumbling out of the office and down the corridor. His voice faded as he called to the boys, panicked and shrill as death. Grace was alone now, and around her the flies coiled. They formed a tornado-like column of sickly buzzing and bumping. They clumped and tumbled. Grace turned slowly and walked to the door. Each step was like a life age. Her body was no longer hers. She was a mute spectator, trapped in some demonic dream, feeling every little clawed foot, every gibbering mouth part, every vibrating wing on her skin. And then she heard a different voice. It came from her throat, but it was not her.
"Picking clean and laying eggs.
The rumbling low growl began.
"Million wings and million legs."
She stepped through the door, and the insects went with her, spinning and whirling in a blob that filled the hallway floor to ceiling.
"Picking clean and minding time,"
it droned on.
"Men in lakes of blood and brine. Gather we to pick it clean, and that what was and what has been."
Down the corridor Grace plodded, surrounded by the impossible growing mass of flies. They shattered windows and ate through the walls. They permeated every vent and door crack as she went. Behind her, back in the office, the bleach-white skeleton of Sister Stacia stood, tray still at the level. And at her skeletal feet, a heap of red goo was all that remained of her kind soul. The caved-in skull was frozen forever in a sort of eyeless howl. What can a tale-teller say to describe such pitiful doom for the undeserving? Ours is a world of hideous mysteries, and justice seems the exception at moments like those. Dr. Howard Stantz stumbled and scrambled like a wounded deer through the Poplar Hill Manor. He gathered the terrified boys one by one, most of them in the reading room. All 7 in tow, he resolved to pack them in his motor car and be rid of the evil place. The car was garaged at the far end of the property, beyond the main hall and the gardener's shed. "Run, boys! Run for the garage, and don't look back!" He cackled, voice breaking with fear. "Run!" Run they did, and in a mad break of fear. One boy wet himself as he dashed, his flapping trousers wet and gathering mud. Another stopped to pick up a stick, thinking himself some Peter Pan hero. He paused to look back, stands at the fore of the group, and the poor boy fell to his knees with fright, stick at his side. Behind them came Grace in her full form. She walked calm as a pallbearer toward them, but each stride glided her 10 feet or more forward. The flies, God, the flies that swarmed and darkened the sky. She began to raise her pale hands, and the insects coiled forward in a drill-like spiral. This reached the boy in an instant and stripped the flesh from his little bones in a nigh horrific rip. The swarm devoured the sloppy mess in seconds, buzzing upward and tearing it all to red ribbon. The skeleton remained there, kneeling, jawless, and clutching that futile stick. Beyond the house and into the gardener's shed the group fled. Stans knew the shed had a back door, and planned at least to delay the deadly cloud of insects by going through to the garage beyond. "For Christ's sake, boys, faster!" His eyes bulged from his head like boiled eggs. His fear was complete. But a fidgety latch and a clutter of tools slowed them, and in moments the boys, Stans, Grace, and her hideous hive were all in the shed. This proved too much for the planked floor, and in a rush of splinters and dust the entire scene plummeted downward. Down they fell. One boy bounced from a jagged rock and snapped his neck. Another was skewered on a stalagmite. Where in hells were they? At once they all met hard stone landings. Ankles twisted and cries echoed. "What in hell's name is this?" Stans muttered, looking up. The light of the shed was 50 feet above them. A cavern, an oubliette, some blasphemous catacomb? But there was no time to speculate, for Grace gently alighted, carried by her tiny minions. With one emotionless turn of her head, she gestured to the surviving boys, who were stripped of their flesh and skin by the flies in one horrible black wave. The swarm grew even bigger, and Stans was the only one left. "What are you?" he begged, mad with fright.
"We are Charon. We are Styx. We are Hell's heart and Heaven's watch,"
the echoing drone explained. The flies lifted Grace from the ground and tightened around her. She could barely be seen among their countless many.
"What world would endure, left to rot in your care?"
Stans only shook his head, hating the sound, hating the answer, hating the voice, drooling with tears for what he should never have seen. For there in front of him, He slowly watched Grace, that delicate little thing, be devoured. The flies formed a sort of thrice-fold helix pattern and meticulously defleshed her bones with a bumping buzz. He could see them. He could feel them, 10 million tiny mouths all nipping away, making a ghoul of her, and eating away what little remained of his mind. And then the skeleton spoke.
"Goodbye, Dr. Stans."
Before he was gone, scoured to nothing by the swarm, Stans caught one final glimpse of horror. Where walls of a cavern should have been, this impossible cavity only had lightless void, broken only by spiral-hung globs of tiny white eggs. These clusters, millions upon millions, rotated slowly, hovering by some spell or gravitational dysfunction of the underworld. Time itself wheeled and folded in compound eyes. He felt the little mouths eating him away, coiling up and making ribbons of him before mercy brought the black. I walk among the pillars. Some lives I drink for millennia. Little motes of fear to slake this dry hellfire. I walk among the pillars, keeping time, feeding on the clumsy curiosity of men. Grace pulled the scratchy blanket down from her face. The dormitory was cold and empty, lonely as a grave. To the window she crept, checking the ceiling, the corners, the dim closets, yawning. Only fog and tree fingers could she see, but a sound broke her weird trance. Hooves clopping on the pave. The sound approached from the valley, 3 or 4 horses and men's voices calling. Fools, drawn like moths to her power. It was happening again. Thank you for tuning in to this transmission of Runehammer. All things cognitive, creative, and imaginative. This is Brandish Gilhelm signing off.